Ever since it was added to GameMaker a few months ago, people have been asking me to talk about the function texture group add. And there seems to be some confusion about what exactly the function texture group add does. There have been some people who have spoken about it who seem to be under the impression that it will create a texture atlas for you. And believe me, I wish that texture group add did texture packing for you. If it did, I wouldn't have just spent 2 videos talking about how you can do texture packing yourself. Anyway, in reality, the function texture group add is pretty niche. It basically does what the dynamic texture group option in your texture group settings will do, except it does it at runtime instead of setting it up through the IDE. This is usually not that useful for most people most of the time. The main use for this function is going to be if you wanted to do something like allow the user to create mods, which might have a bunch of different textures that come with it, and you want to allow them to load a texture group instead of loading each sprite one by one. Anyway, to show off what you can do with this function, I'm going to start with the texture atlas that I created in the last video. So if I go into my game's data files, you can see that I've gone and added the texture atlas as a sprite. I've saved it as a sprite, and I've added it to the game's included files, and we're just going to be looking at this and loading a bunch of sprites off this. In some sense, we're kind of going to be doing the opposite of what we did in the last 2 videos when we built our texture atlases. Instead of taking a bunch of sprites and compositing them into a single image like this, we are going to take a single image like this and we are going to break it apart into a bunch of sprites. So, if I go over to the create event and the draw event of obj_packer here, I did kind of go and just delete all of the actual texture atlas and code from last time. I also deleted the sprites themselves, so there are no sprites except for this placeholder sprite, this white square in this project right now. But if I were to use the function texture group add, we can pass this function a couple of arguments. And by the way, my nose is really stuffed up today because it is the middle of winter and that just happens sometimes. So if I sound funnier than usual, that's probably why. Anyway, first I'm going to want to give the texture group add function a name, and I'm just going to call that tg_atlas as a name for this texture group. If you have a naming system that you like to use for your texture groups, you probably want to have whatever name that you give the texture group add function match those. tg_whatever is pretty common. Anyway, next we need a file name or buffer or array of file names or buffers. I honestly think the name of the second argument to this function here is a little bit lacking, because in addition to a file name or buffer or array of file names or buffers, it can also be an array of file names and buffers. You can mix and match. So what it really should say down here is file name or buffer or array of file names or buffers or array of file names and buffers. And I really hope that Yo-Yo Games gets around to fixing this incorrect documentation one of these days. Anyway, we're going to keep things simple, and we're going to say atlas.png because that's the name of the file that we want to load, found in the game's data files. And lastly, we need a struct or asset descriptions. Struct of asset descriptions, I'm sorry. I'm going to call it a sprite info, and I'm going to set that up in a minute. But firstly, you can have just one image that you're going to load as your texture group with the texture group add function, or you can have multiple. This isn't something that usually gets talked about a lot when it comes to texture groups. I don't remember if I mentioned it when I made a video on texture groups a couple of years ago or not, but it is actually possible if you have a lot of sprites in a texture group that GameMaker's ASCII compiler might create multiple atlases for each texture group if you have too many sprites to fit on a single atlas. And with the texture group add function, it is possible to create a group which has multiple individual texture like atlases within it. I'm probably not going to do that right now because I only have like 20 or 30 sprites on this texture atlas. But if you have multiple like atlases, atlas 1, atlas 2, whatever, you can put them in an array. Or you can also put the raw image data in a buffer, which I will also get to in a moment. Let me see. So the sprite info. This is going to be a struct. Inside this struct is going to be a single value, which is going to be sprites. Inside this struct is going to be possibly quite a lot of stuff. So we're going to start out with something that looks like the name of a sprite that we want to add. And if I go back to this for a minute, the sprite that happens to be in the upper left just happens to be the like the duck sprite. So I might as well just start with that in this demonstration. So I'm going to create a sprite, and it's going to be called something like SPR duck or something like that. And this is crucially not a sprite that exists in this project. Again, this is a sprite which we will be creating ourselves through code in like a minute. I'm going to make that another struct. It's going to contain a few things, and by a few things I mean rather a lot of things. Firstly, width. So we're going to give it the dimensions of the sprite that we want to add. I'm going to just say that our first duck sprite to start out with is going to be 32 by 32. It's also going to have frame information, which is going to be an array. This array is going to contain structs, and this each struct in this frames array is going to contain information on however many subimages you want in this sprite. So I'm going to start out by saying our frame index 0 x position is going to be 0, frame index y position is going to be 0, because the sprite that we're gonna add first is the one that's just in the upper left of this image. And this is kind of the bare minimum that you need to get started with texture group add. So you pass this sprite info struct to this texture group add function. It will take the atlas.png from the game's data files. It will load it, and it will create a sprite of this size from this this coordinate in that image. And now, if we say texture group load tg_atlas, we're going to actually load this in memory. So this is going to create basically a dynamic texture group, the same way that you can create a dynamic texture group with the texture groups like UI in the GameMaker IDE. And it's going to by default be unloaded, and you probably, if you want to actually do anything with it, load it with the texture group load function so that the sprite data itself actually gets loaded into GameMaker's memory. Anyway, if I go over to the draw event, we will not be able to access spr_duck or anything like that just through code as an asset name the way that you would if it was added to the GameMaker IDE. So there's a couple ways that we can get this information. One would be to use the function asset get index. And this is going to take the name of the sprite. And when you call the texture group add function, the sprites that you create from this information will be of the name that you gave it in the sprite struct over here as the name in the sprite struct. So we could say var duck sprite equals asset get index spr_duck. We could, if we wanted to, draw sprite. Duck sprite subimage 0. The x position can be 32 on the game window. How about? And now when I do that, GameMaker's going to open up on my under the monitor because I forgot to switch my primary back to this one for this recording, and we are going to have a sprite of a duck. And this was a lot of work to get just this sprite off of this texture atlas, right? This is not something you would do ordinarily in GameMaker if you had the option to just add it to the GameMaker IDE. But in situations where that isn't something that you can do, again, probably the reason that most people are going to be using this function is because they want to have user-generated content, and they want to be able to have the user submit their own texture atlases with some sprite information and load it into the game. But if that is something that you actually need in your game, this admittedly is easier than what you would have had to do before the function texture group add was added to GameMaker, because before you would have had to either like do all this yourself, which was a huge pain, or you just would have had to like load all these sprites one by one, which kind of becomes an organizational inconvenience as much as anything else. Anyway, so if I come back here, we can, because there are multiple frames of animation in this duck sprite, I can go and define a few more frames. So this sprite animation has 3 frames, so I can also say frame 2 is going to live at coordinate x32, y0. Frame 3 is going to live at x64, y0. And now if I wanted to like show this animating, this sprite is going to have 3 sub-images to go with it. But if I just wanted to show it animating, you can use something like the current second built-in variable. And we can see that every second we're going to kind of flip through these 3 frames of animation. Which is quite convenient. What's also convenient is that you can take pretty much any information that you can find in GameMaker Sprite Editor like this, like texture settings or collision settings or even 9-slice settings, and you can define them through the texture group add function in the sprite information struct. So this is where I'm going to just go and open up the documentation on the texture group add function, and normally I don't really like to say just go read the documentation in a video, but in the case of the sprite info struct, there is so much that you can do here that it would be a little bit impractical to just make a video rattling it all off. Also, by the way, so I mentioned earlier that you can load a buffer, that you can send a buffer to the texture group add function. And for the most part, the contents of that buffer would just be like an array of pixel data, so red, green, blue, alpha for each pixel in the image. But it also does want a bit of header information, so that you can like tell the system exactly what the width and height of the image is. I think this is a bitmap header. Like if you were to open up a bitmap file in a hex editor, I think you would see something like this, but I can't remember exactly if that's what it is.
Hey.
Anyway, more importantly, the struct format section of the documentation will describe each and every value that you can put into the sprite info struct. So in addition to the width, height, and frame XY, you can define things like the X offset, the Y offset for each frame, cropping information for each frame, if whatever texture packer you used happened to crop off white space from each sprite before putting it on the texture atlas to save space. There's a texture page index, so if you have multiple images in your group of texture atlases that you want to load, you can index each sprite frame and tell the system what texture atlas to look for it on. And there's also stuff like the bounding box information, like I said. There is 9-slice information, like I said. There's even like broadcast message information if you happen to want to use the broadcast message system for sprite animations, which occasionally can come in useful. Anyway, so in reality, when you use this function, you're probably not going to be building the sprite info struct by hand like this. You're going to be generating it from whatever you use to create your texture atlas. Whether that was the sprite packing code that we wrote in the previous videos like this, you can reformat the metadata that goes into that this function returns to look more like what this is. Or if you use some other texture packer, like an online texture packer or another third-party texture packer to create your atlas, you would take whatever metadata that gave you for each sprite, and you would format that to look like this through some automated process so that you don't have to do it by hand. So speaking of which, I have gone and basically done that with each of the sprites that we packed in the previous video on texture packing, and I have formatted it like this with the sprites and the width and the height and the frame info and that kind of thing. And I'm just going to go and save this. Where does this project live? I'm just going to go and save this in the included files of this project, and we can call this like atlasinfo.json or something like that. And now, instead of writing this all out by hand, I'm going to load this atlasinfo.json into GameMaker. I'm just going to go say, I think the fastest way to do this would be to just load it as a buffer. So let's say our buffer equals buffer load atlasinfo.json. We can say sprite info equals var JSON text equals buffer read buffer string or buffer text, var sprite info equals JSON parse JSON text, and we probably want to delete the buffer when we're done. And now we have all of our sprite info. If I run the game now, we should see the same thing that we saw before. We're not drawing anything differently. We are still drawing the SPR duck. But now we also have all the other sprites added to the game. And if I actually run this through the debugger, which is also going to open on my other screen for some reason, we should be able to see, like, no, it's not gonna show us all the other sprites in the resource view. All right, fine. GameMaker's debugger is boring. I feel like it should for some reason, but it's not. Maybe I'll feature request that at some point later. Anyway, texture group get sprites is another function. Texture group get sprites is another function that you can use, and that will fetch all the sprites in a texture group. tg_atlas. This will also work to fetch all the sprites that exist in a texture group that's built in to your project through the texture group UI. There's also functions that are similar that are like texture group get fonts, texture group get tile sets, and texture group get textures if you want to fetch some other information related to those. Anyway, I'm going to say all sprites equals texture group get sprites. And now we can just go in a loop and we can draw all these. Some of these sprites are going to be different, like heights and widths, so I can't just like stack them using the loop index or anything like that. I'm going to say for var I equals 0, I is less than array length, all sprites I++. Let's say our sprite equals all sprites index I. We can draw a sprite. That sprite, subimage 0, x can be, let's say 32, y can be y coordinate, y plus equals sprite get height. To move it down a little bit, to move it down the next line. We can also draw the names to go with all these. I did say that the names of all the sprites are going to be whatever happens to be the key name in the JSON when you load it in. And if I say draw text at position 32 plus sprite get width sprite, y can also be that y coordinate. Sprite get name sprite, we'll be able to see that as well. And if I run the game now, we can see that the order is not exactly the same as what was in the JSON. I don't know why. I don't know if they're like, if the keys are hashed and then the hashes are pulled out in order or something like that. But we can see that we have SPR tree, we have SPR flowers triple, SPR card whatever, and so on down the line. The duck and the dog sprites do specifically have multiple subimages that were defined by me, not by the texture packers in the last video. If we wanted to see the frames of animation, we could do the current second thing again, and that would have the duck and the dog sprites animating over time. All right. That's really all there is to the texture group add function. I guess it's worth mentioning that just like with any other dynamic texture group unload, if you need to unload the texture atlas, if you're like done with the level that the sprites would be relevant to, or something like that, you might as well unload it to free them from memory. Again, just like any other texture group. If you try to like draw sprites like this that are unloaded, also as with any other dynamic texture group, you will see the checker pattern. And in this case, you're going to see it strobing kind of headache-inducingly because we are constantly unloading the texture group, and then it is not being automatically loaded before you draw a sprite, and because texture loading will happen like asynchronously if it has to. If a sprite like this is drawn before the texture is actually loaded, it will just draw that like test default pattern, checker pattern sprite. You of course avoid that by calling the texture group load function on a texture group before you actually draw anything, preferably during like a cutaway, like a loading screen or a room transition or something like that, before the sprite is actually needed on the screen. Anyway, we're going to get rid of that because it looks stupid, and I think I'm going to end this video. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the description of this video. You should go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I hope you all enjoyed that, and I'm going to go and drink some hot tea or something now. I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Zach Robinson, Squarecrow, Spide Games, Pixelated Pope, Paradox, Manta Ray, GameMaker, Gamer Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, Brenton, Bokeh Dev, and Argo the Naut for supporting these videos. If you would like to join these wonderful people, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.